We are honored to have Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith here tonight to help us answer some of these questions. Dr. Briscoe-Smith earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard University and her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. With her postdoctoral work at the University of California, San Francisco, she deepened her specialization in trauma and ethnic minority mental health. Since then, Dr. Briscoe-Smith has combined her love of teaching with advocacy in her work as a clinical psychologist, educator, and consultant. Currently, she is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Wright Institute, where she is a professor. She also provides consultation and training to nonprofits and schools, helping them adopt trauma-informed practices and to increase their cultural accountability. And as we can see, she educates groups like ours through her speaking events, her online classes, and through the resources she shares on her website, drbriscoesmith.com. Dr. Briscoe-Smith will begin with an overview of our topic and then answer audience questions. You can submit questions throughout this event. In fact, I believe there are already some coming in using the Q&A function. As with an in-person event, she may not get to every single question, but she's going to try to answer as many as possible in the time we have. There is also going to be some live polling during our session, so definitely participate. We welcome all of your input. There's a chat function, and you can use it if you have technical difficulties, but it will not be functioning for group discussion this evening. And finally, our last housekeeping item, we want you to know that this event is being recorded and it will be available on the SSALA website for 30 days after the event. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Allison Briscoe-Smith. Make sure that you've got your audio.
I'm unmuted. So welcome to Zoom, right? In terms of how it happens. Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I really appreciated the framing and also the scope of what your organization is really here to do, which is to bring community. I desperately wish that I could be in person with you all, but I'm very glad that we actually have this forum to connect in a very different way. So thank you for this space, and I want to talk a little bit about what I hope for us to be able to address today. I'm really eager to hear your questions and also really appreciative of the help as well that I'm getting. So I've got some technical assistance in the background that's going to help me be able to kind of address some of the questions as they come up. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm a child psychologist by training. But I wanted to let you know about a couple of other things that really frame my perspective. So the majority of my work is in the context of trauma. So working on behalf of families and children who've experienced really difficult things, the things that we can kind of imagine, like child abuse, neglect, natural disaster, just the hard things that we know so many families have been through. So that's the frame that I have, is really thinking about how people survive and actually are resilient in the face of big challenges. It's with that background and perspective that I also come to this conversation about race. I really fundamentally think that we are able to talk about race, that we are capable, and that we are in fact tasked and responsible for talking about race, especially in the current times. There are typically a couple questions that kind of come my way, which we're going to address tonight, which is, should I talk about race? When should I talk about race? And how should I talk about race? Those are the things that we're going to get a chance to kind of talk about over the course of the day tonight. And I'll take some pauses here and there so I can start engaging with some of your questions as we go. The big pieces, though, that I really need to mention in this kind of context is that I'm a parent. I have 3 children. I have an 11-year-old son. I have a recently turned 10-year-old daughter, and I have a 3-year-old daughter as well. Our conversation tonight is really going to focus on teens and tweens. We're going to move through the whole developmental continuum so we can get an understanding about where kids have both kind of come from and how the development might change over time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin by sharing my screen and just take us through a couple of slides. I have way too many slides up right now, so just give me a moment and bear with me as I get this going. So we're going to be focusing on this kind of question right here, which is how we can actually talk about and be present in the conversation about race. So the first kind of pieces that I kind of mentioned is that these are the ideas here. Should I, when should I, and how should I? But I actually wanted us to begin to get a sense of how people are feeling just in general. And I'm going to have the help that I have here, James, help pull up a couple of different polling options. So I'll stop share real quick. And I want to just have and invite us to kind of do a couple of questions to kind of get a sense about how often are we really talking about race and what's kind of coming up. So you should see a couple of poll questions coming up, and I'm going to take us through these. So the very first one that people should have the ability to see is, do you talk to your children about race? And I want to invite people to indicate, how do you? Yes, I do. No, I don't. The next is, how comfortable are you talking about race? Not at all, somewhat, or very comfortable. And then we're going to move to some of the barriers, right? So what are the barriers? I don't know how to talk about race. I don't know when. I'm uncomfortable. I don't have time to do it, right? Or maybe you don't feel like there are barriers. So I'm going to invite you to just spend a minute to do that. And then we'll be able to kind of see, and I believe James will help me with this, be able to see what the results of the polling is. So as that's kind of going on, the idea is to kind of think about these kinds of questions. How comfortable are you? How familiar are you? And what could be done to support you in that familiarity? And that's what it is that we're going to be kind of talking about over the course of the day. So you should have, and I have a couple of the results in that are coming in right now. So I don't know if you have the ability to see it, but I can see some of the results that have come in so far. So do you talk about race? So about 96% of you indicate that you do, that you are talking about race. So that allows us to kind of move to this place about not whether, should you, but people are. The next kind of question is that I see up here is the barrier part. So what are the barriers to talking about race? About 20% are indicating I don't know how, 10% indicating I don't know when. Another group, about 12%, I'm uncomfortable. And then 42% of you feel like there aren't any barriers to talking about race. So that's a great place for us to start, and is actually different than what we find in the bulk of the majority of the literature and the psychological literature. The bulk of the psychological literature indicates that majority of parents are not speaking about race to their children. And this is true across the developmental timeline, from little kids all the way up. There is a split, however, which is that the research indicates that parents of color are more likely to be having conversations about race with their children, that the need, the press, and the salience of those conversations are more pressing for families of color, and that white families tend to lag behind in terms of talking about race. So again, that's what the research says, but you have this opportunity to be in community with a lot of folks who are talking about and thinking about race. So we're going to go ahead and kind of use that as our framework by which to kind of jump back into the shared pace here. So should I? Many of you have addressed that because you are. I'd be interested to hear about like the frequency of this and in what context folks are doing that. When should you is the developmental kind of question. Again, I'm assuming many of you are parents of teens, so we're going to lean into that. So as soon as I can click, there's a couple of pieces that I really want to pause on. I'm assuming that the majority of you and many folks that are watching who are in this space of talking about race are going to have different feelings about it, different feelings of both your efficacy, your ability, your interest to do so. But I want to kind of frame and pause a moment, because we're having this conversation about race in a particular time. We're having this conversation about race in the context of a global pandemic. I don't know how many of your schools are back to in-person settings. I'm talking to you all from Oakland, California, where our school system is still in distance learning and probably will be for a long time. Um, and we're also doing this at a particular time of a politicized event. The ways in which race is very salient, has been salient for a lot of folks, but particularly salient in the context of the multiple murders that have occurred and the media attention to those murders. So this is a complicated and really necessary time, but it's a time where, as I'm working with families, I'd like for us to think about grace. So as I support families and schools and institutions in talking about race, I want to invoke this piece. So grace can be defined in many different ways. I have a great friend who defined grace as unmerited favor. What if you didn't have to be the perfect parent in order to get a little bit of a reprieve or a moment of kindness or a temporary exemption? This is idea about slowing down. And one of the things that's really important for intervening upon race and racial bias in particular is our ability to actually slow down. So I like to think about grace as our window of opportunity to do so. But I'd like to invite us to think about grace in three different ways. One of which is grace for ourselves as parents. So this is a particularly challenging time for many of us as parents, the ways in which we're maybe going into the field because we're essential workers, maybe the ways in which we're home with our children all the time, maybe in the ways in which that we are trying to hold these complicated conversations. But the invitation is for us to pay attention to and offer ourselves some grace in this. So the example that I have is, on March 13th, when our community went into shelter in place, I suddenly was thrust into the position of being a sixth grade teacher, a fourth grade teacher, and a daycare provider on top of my job. That was really hard to do, and I wasn't great at it. And I really struggled, and my kids struggled even more. But I had to pause and think, well, I haven't been trained to do this. I haven't been supported to do this. So to give myself a little bit of a reprieve that I'm not going to be the most amazing sixth grade teacher, when those of you that are sixth grade teachers knows that that takes a lot of work. Grace for ourselves. In the conversation about race, grace that for ourselves, that these are going to be complicated conversations. Perhaps you're going to make a mistake. Perhaps you're going to say something that you want to go back to, but that's okay. The second level is to think about grace for our children. On March 13th, I picked up my children and they haven't been friends since. Many of you are in the same position, that we've had a radical shift in how our children are doing. I just spent time today with, and actually this happens a lot, where I'm working with parents who are saying, my child will just not sit down for an hour in front of Zoom. And my reframe to that is, well, why would they? If we were in a classroom, we wouldn't expect for a child to sit in their seat and stare at a screen and never move for an hour, for 2 hours, for 3 hours. That's not the way that classrooms work for our young kids. That's not even the way that our classroom works for our teenagers. Our teens are multitasking, multiply engaged. So why would we expect that they somehow come home and be 16 and stare at a screen? Some of you have kids that do that, but many folks are doing. So we've got to offer grace to our children. The third is offering grace for our school systems. Here in Oakland, I was part of a community forum where the school district was laying out what was going to happen for our school this year. And there was a chat on the side, and the chat was just streaming. And it was streaming with anxiety and worry. And it was streaming with, this is the worst idea. This is the best idea. This is terrible. But there wasn't a whole lot of space for grace. So my assumption is, with so many folks on the call tonight, there are some of you that are responsible for decisions in schools. Or if not, let's imagine what it must be like to try to be a person responsible for making these decisions and to offer some grace. So grace for ourselves as parents, grace for our children, and grace for our school systems. Again, I'm talking about this in the context of both pandemic, but also in terms of racialized conversation as well. My last piece that I'll say about grace is that it's not an opportunity to get rid of all of our boundaries or accountability. So just because I have an understanding that my children are now getting their social interaction from screens doesn't mean that I can now say, sure, you can have 24 hours of screen time. There are some boundaries. Just because I find it really hard for me to kind of teach in the home doesn't mean that I can say, I'm actually not going to engage with you at all. There have to be boundaries. And the same thing in terms of our schools. We do need to have accountability for how are we talking about issues of race within our schools? How are we addressing these issues? And how are we addressing the safety of our children? So That's a big caveat, but it's a caveat that I think is really important before we move to the next pieces. So the next piece here is, I'm going to move away from this part, but actually to move to this, which is we need to have a developmental understanding, which is about how children understand race. So the research is pretty consistent that children begin to think about race as early as 3 to 6 months. Rather than thinking about race, what they begin to do is to notice race. I want to begin way back here, even though many of you are parenting teens, to think about this is not necessarily a new construct, that children have been working their entire lives to make sense of race. So they're looking at race, they're noticing race as young as 3 and 6 months. 2 and 3-year-old toddlers are actually demonstrating that they're using race to choose playmates, with the majority of kids indicating same race preference. Around school age, that kids are demonstrating the same racial attitudes as adults, including biases and prejudice. They're also understanding race is associated with status, or rather with power. And 7 through 9-year-olds, they have an increased understanding of societal norms related to race, and we actually see an uptick in their outgroup biases, so biases against kids that are of different races. Um, then what starts happening around 10 is something really interesting, which is within the kind of research around prejudice and bias is this steep drop off around age 10. And for a while, theorists thought, well, it means that by age 10, kids have figured out how not biased. It turned out that that effect totally went away once you actually added in social desirability measures. In other words, kids started by around 10 or 11 knowing that I'm not supposed to talk about race, I'm not supposed to talk about bias. That's very different than not having biases or operating off of them. It means actually a sophistication that kids are seeing, reading, making sense of bias, and they're trying to figure out what they're supposed to do, but they've already learned that they're not supposed to talk about it. What we find in terms of, as I mentioned, the research of what parents are doing is, for the bulk of these years in particular, parents tend to be resoundingly silent or are only reacting to kids after they're bringing up conversation. Again, I have to pause on this again to reiterate that there's a difference in the field in terms of the difference in the research as terms of what it says about kids of color, which is more likely kids of color are experiencing to talk about race because it's a necessity for them to negotiate a racialized world around them. What we see also around ages 10 and 11 is that kids start turning away from parents as their main source of information and turning toward peers. So there's this kind of question that kind of comes up around, when should I kind of talk to them, or how should I? And I want us to kind of think about it in this way, which is that we are communicating about race even if we're not talking about it. That kids are learning, especially through these ages, so much about race. This slide is an opportunity for us to think about where the bulk of this research actually starts from. It starts from Mamie and Kenneth Clark, who did the doll test, which is a seminal psychological study that was used for the 1954 segregation Supreme Court case. So to say that this research has been well established and comes from not only the 1950s, but has been reiterated again, is an important way for us to think about how robust this finding is that children are trying to make sense of race. So I wanted to use this kind of analogy here to think a little bit about our opportunity to kind of talk about race and thinking about race. So there's this example that I have, which is a friend of mine who's a white woman who made a very conscious choice to live in Oakland because it's very diverse, and made a very conscious choice to send her children to very diverse Oakland public schools. And as we were talking about race, she asked me this kind of question. She said, well, I've made these conscious decisions as to where put my children because we value diversity. And we've made this choice about their schools. Isn't that enough? And the analogy that I'd like to kind of leverage is that I think it's super important that this woman has made this choice, and so many of you have made these choices as well. But I want to push on the idea that actually just having exposure to diversity is enough. The analogy is this, that if I were to take a toddler and leave them in this beautiful, well-appointed library with so many beautiful different books, would I leave and come back expecting the child to know how to read? And the short answer is no. We have to teach our children how to read the racialized world around them, teach them how to value diversity, teach them how to make sense of it, teach them how to understand the things that we find difficult to understanding. Why does racism exist? Why do systems of racism exist? Why do people treat each other that way? But we have to do that thinking on our own and help our children to make sense of this, especially if we're really interested in dismantling race and dismantling racism, rather. So that's again a way to kind of lean into this idea about what is it that we could actually teach our children about race. Um, I have a couple of different questions that are kind of emerging, so I'm going to kind of pause just a minute before we get to this next section, so I can take a chance on some of these questions. So there are a couple questions that are coming up about the right way of saying or the right things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and deconstruct it. But here's a question that has come up. So in talking about race in our home, our son has become a bit self-hating, if I'm being honest, which is, so am I, that white people have done so many terrible things and he's struggling with that as an identity. I know no one cares about how white people are feeling, but I don't want to go so far in the direction that he thinks white people are just bad, or are we, and that's an age appropriate feeling. I'm gonna just pause on the screen share so we can just kind of listen and be in dialogue a little bit. I think that's a really wonderful question. And so here's how I kind of understand it. The question is, in the conversation that this white family is having about race, that there's a moment that's what's going on is that their child is starting to be self-hating or not liking other white folks and really struggling with that. I want to identify that this is actually a place that we can kind of own as a problem. We don't want our kids, any of our children, to not like themselves or not feel good about themselves or their identity. But I also want to pause and frame that this is a very normative kind of step. So I'm going to pause it just a little bit to talk about Beverly Tatum, who spends a lot of time talking about race and racial identity development. I would strongly recommend that folks take a look at her work. I'll put it in the chat, which is Beverly Tatum's book, which is Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It's a fantastic read, and it's one that actually speaks about something that's super salient for our teens and tweens, which is racial identity development. So there's another theorist named Janet Helms, an African-American psychologist, who's actually talked quite extensively about white racial identity development. And all of these racial identity developments have a couple models, have a couple of different premises underlying. They speak about a moment of early development, which is often categorized as racelessness, lack of awareness around race. I'm going to put the little star and caveat, say that the research is that we have is that many kids don't have a racelessness, that they're actually seeing and paying attention to race. But then the next kind of phase comes a particular event or moment that calls young people, calls adults into awareness about what race is like for them and how they are impacted by race. Janet Helms talks about, for white folks, that then there's a decision point. So I see and I'm witnessing all this racism around, why people are being treated this way, and I've got to make a decision point. I have to go and learn more about this, learn about my role in this, my privilege in this. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm a bad person? And that learning is the reckoning that so many people have been really talking about. It requires a whole lot of support, space, and thinking. And that there's a branch. And one part of the branch is, okay, I've learned more about this and I decide to reject the idea that racism really exists. I'm going to go back to a raceless idea. I'm going to go back to this is not a problem that I participate in or benefit in. And then there's another stage where people make a decision to, this is horrible and this is a lot. How do I reckon with this? And to move to a place of, well, one way I can reckon with this is by being distant from whiteness. So maybe I start denigrating myself as a white person. Maybe I start making fun of other white people. Maybe I choose only to associate with people of color. Maybe I tend to separate. And I identify that kind of place as something that happens a lot with our adolescents as they're trying to reconcile their identity in a particular way. But the next part is important, which is the idea is to move beyond that and to move to another place, which is reconciling and thinking about one's own privilege or bias and thinking about how one can be committed to moving into action. all the racial identity development theories that are pretty much in the forefront talk about this movement, from awareness to struggling with the impact, making a decision to reckon with oneself, including Black racial identity models where people dive into understanding and knowing about oneself, and then needing to make a decision point to understand Blackness or whiteness as a part of an intersectional identity, and then moving into a place of activism on multiple identities. We could talk a whole lot about why those are beautiful opportunities and beautiful models. That was a really long psychologist way of saying, I really appreciate this question. I want to frame that this is a pretty normative kind of experience as people are reckoning with their own sense of an understanding of privilege. And what it's coming down to is people are thinking about, am I bad? And kids and teens are trying to think about, does this make me bad? I think we got to do the work first as adults to think about, how do I understand this? What does privilege mean? There's a great theorist, his name is Ken Hardy, another African American psychologist who really focuses on trauma. And he talks about why race-based discussions are difficult in this particular way. So he says that sometimes what happens in a race-based conversation, especially across different races, is that people will move to a place of feeling, oh, I'm being called a bad person, or I'm being called a racist, and I don't like that. So I pull back to the wounded places within myself. So if you've ever heard or said things, well, I can't possibly be a racist because I'm poor. I can't possibly be a racist because I'm disabled. I can't possibly be a bad person because I've had it hard. How can you tell me I'm privileged when I've worked so hard for everything that I have and I've suffered so much? And I really appreciate Dr. Hardy's frame because it's one that allows us to kind of step into empathy. So to circle back to this question, there's an idea that this question says, which is, I know that no one cares about how white people are feeling. And I want to kind of question that. I think that we have the capacity for profound empathy, and that we can actually empathize and be compassionate with each other and understand that when someone is suffering, and if you feel really terrible, that's going to have an impact on me. I want you to be well. I want us in community to be well. Now, there's a question about whose work that is and how we can do all that, but I think this is the work that we can do together. So again, another very, very long detour that I've taken, but one that I hope, especially in the context of what adolescents are doing, helps you to kind of think about, this is an identity movement. That what our teenagers are doing in particular is they're looking to their peers, they're looking to you, to how they want to identify. This is also a place where we're going to get into conflict with our kids. I don't know how many of you are being out-woked by your kids, where your teens are kind of telling you or calling you out on your behavior or how you're doing, or that's really racist, or that's really sexist, or that's really cisnormative, dad. That our kids, if we're lucky enough, are going to outpace us in how they think about these. But that's a challenge for us. And that's also part of the development, that part of what they're supposed to be doing is play with us, to push on us, to understand how they're going to identify each other and how they're going to identify themselves. So with that, I want to go ahead and move back to the screen and talk a little bit about a framework for how we could, the how kind of question. So go back to sharing my screen. So we're going to talk about the how question, but I want to pause and kind of come back to racial trauma in a particular way. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a therapist that really focuses on trauma. This idea of racial trauma has resonated for a very long time now, has definitely been really impactful in terms of so many people's experiences, and has moved toward being really codified within the psychological literature. This is a definition that is offered, which is that racial trauma is a form of race-based stress, which refers to BIPOC people's reactions to dangerous events, real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination, and that these experiences might include threats of harm and injury, humiliation, shame, the witnessing of discrimination towards other people of color and Indigenous folks. Racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure. So I feel like this definition is pretty important because it allows us to kind of think about another factor that our teenagers might be exposed to. Our teens, if they have a phone, means that they've witnessed people be murdered. And most likely in June that they saw George Floyd being murdered. Um, our our brains, our spirits, our minds weren't really built to see the rapid scrolling and the viral images of death in this particular way, and our teens are the ones that are most likely to be seeing it, or to be posting about it, or to be sharing it, or to be trying to engage in conversation around it. So we need to frame that our kids are experiencing this. The way that I understand trauma is as a continuum of stress. So moving from normative experiences of stress all the way to what I understand as trauma, or the pathological experience of stress. There's two things that make stress pathological. One of which is the height of the stress, a big event. The other is the length, how long it persists. And what happens for many folks is a combination of a big height and a persistence. We can argue, for example, that shelter in place was a height and also is persisting. But I want to frame not everybody's experiencing this whole kind of collective experience as a trauma. Not everyone is experiencing what they saw on their phones as a trauma, but those who have proximity to it, that wasn't on your phone, that was actually outside. That wasn't just some random person that was your uncle or your cousin or reminds you of. That the proximity to this increases the likelihood that this is going to be experienced as trauma. In preparing for this talk, the committee was really, really thoughtful about, we want people to walk away with tools. And the main tool that I want you to have regarding racial trauma is, I want you to think about, is this experience one that is cumulative and distressing and that my child is experiencing? And how are they reacting to it? What we look for in terms of the context of trauma is watching kind of behavior. And there's a lot of behavior that we can listen to. The big thing that we look for as clinicians are big alterations in behavior. Now, I got to make the caveat that if any of you all have 16-year-olds right now, they're probably sleeping differently. You know, they may be sleeping or too much or too little. Just got in an argument with my 11-year-old who forgot to eat today. So it's a little bit more difficult in this context where the typical supports and structures for kids have kind of fallen apart. But my invitation is for you all to listen to what might be going on and ask your kids, how are you making sense of this? What was it like to see that on the phone? How are you feeling? Do you need a break from your social media? How do you want to think about this? And then for us to kind of hold these pieces of trauma in mind, hold these invitations for us to kind of pay attention. And then I want to kind of talk about this framework for how it is that we can talk about race with our children. So I get so many questions, and it looks like you all are a group of folks that are really already talking with their children quite a lot about race. But what I want to encourage you to do is to think about a framework and an organization for how you can do so. So there's research to indicate from both Bruce Feiler and others that families that have a family mission statement are happier. We can debate about what that means. But idea around a family mission statement sometimes feels really intimidating, but it's actually pretty simple. So I want to encourage you all to think about a framework by which you talk to your children about race. And there are a couple of different factors, one of which is, what are the kid factors? So this means that our conversations with kids have to be tailored to who they are. What's their race? What's their gender? What are their other intersectional identities? What kind of school do they go to? Are they the only kid of color? What's their temperament like? So the example that I give is that my son runs a little bit more like me, a little bit more anxious, so that when I give him a bit of information, he's going to move directly to catastrophe. So if I give him information about kind of race and what's kind of going on, his first jump is that there's bias, or the first jump is that it's harm is going to come to him, which means I have to give him a message in a very different way. My middle child is 10, and I always describe it, she's the person that I want to be when I grow up. She is brave and she's courageous and she's very wise. And when I give her a bit about race, she kind of takes it very stoically, yes, that's very terrible. And what can we do to help? But what I'm learning about her is that a month later, I'll find her still postulating about it, still thinking about it. So I've got to give her the information and then come back to her. Take it all the way to development. My 3-year-old, okay, so that's a very different conversation with the 3-year-old, right? So this is developmental change and also who they are. I'll also mention, for example, that my kids are also walk through the world very differently. My son is read as Black. My daughter is read as Latinx. And my third daughter is read as white. So the ways in which they're treated and negotiate through the world are very, very different. So those are kid factors. The next piece is that we have parent factors. Who are your parent? What do you have to offer to this conversation? So, for example, my partner is Mexican and white. When my children have questions about what it's like to move through the world as a mixed person, they can talk to their father in a way that I can't offer them. I can guess, but I'm not mixed. I can talk about and I can, hypothesize, but it's not my lived experiences. So we have something different to offer to each other in those moments. So these are the factors, but they rest within the context, and they rest within the context of a family mission statement. So let's think about what a family mission statement is. A family mission statement, while it sounds really fancy, is actually something that you say and talk about all the time. I want to invite you to kind of think about what are the things that you say in your family that begin with we. So when your kids were little, it was probably things like, well, we don't hit, or we are kind. But what are the things that you're saying to your older children now? Well, we are strong, or we can handle difficult things, or we climb mountains, or we value all people. So, my invitation to you is to think through what are the things that you say to your children again and again. So, listen for that. And the next kind of piece is to think about what's your family mission, or your mission statement, or your vision. So think about this as your values. Who do you want your family to be? How do you want them to act? What are you encouraging them to do? And how could you tell if you're living this? So how could you tell if your children, for example, one that kind of stands out for me as a family I was working with, that said, we value all people. Okay, so how would you be living that? How would that look like? So what would your children be doing? How would they be understanding the world around them? So again, the idea is you can do this in so many different ways. The book kind of version with Bruce Feiler kind of talks about come together for a family dinner or a family meeting. Ask the children, what are the things that you really value? Who is it that we want to be? Who are we as a family? If you had to have a family motto or a team shirt or thing, what would it be? So there's ways that this can be fun. This is ways that it can be challenging. This is also ways that our teens should be engaging with us about who we are as a family and how they feel like they differ. And then that's a seat for kind of conversation, but it's the lens by which you come back to these conversations. So when you're having a conversation with your child about how are you understanding the world around you, it comes back to, well, we are kind and we think that what happened there was not kind, or we value other people. And what we saw happening there was not a value. What do we want to do about it? I want to push a little bit and ask you all to also think about what's your vision of racial justice. So many folks are coming to this conversation about race, which I think is so compelling and so amazing. And I want us to kind of think about, well, what's your vision of racial justice? If you were to be living in a racially just world, what would that mean? What would that look like? Who would you be interacting with? How would your children be treated? How would you be treated? These are the multiple kinds of questions that you can ask yourself as a means of getting organized. Now, let me tell you the other story about why it is that I kind of come to this, both because in the research part, but also because as a person that spends a lot of time consulting with organizations, one of the first questions I typically get called into organizations is some racial strife has happened. And my first question to them is usually, do you have a statement of racial justice? Do you have a statement of diversity or equity? And if their answer is no, then I know I'll be consulting with them for a long time to help them create that. But if their answer is yes, we have a statement of racial justice, then my only next piece is, well, what got in the way of living that? It's an organized framework by which you can think about and address the questions of how. How do I speak to them about this? Well, what values are there in your family? How do you want to think about this? I want to think about this kind of value part a little bit before I take a break to take some questions, because I see a couple that are coming up, which is to think about this motto, but also think about our opportunity to move into action. There's this great report that just came out by McKinsey and Company regarding the impact of COVID on very large corporate spaces. So I think that's different in many different ways, but large corporate spaces. And what they found was that productivity is up in many places, that there's also a disproportionate impact on how COVID is impacting folks within the workforce. And this is, again, a place that I want to talk about the intersectionality of what COVID is doing and also our particular racialized moment. This research indicates that women are continuing to bear disproportionate impact in terms of parenting responsibilities. I know that that's not true across the board, but it's showing up here that women are feeling like they have to both be showing up fully as the new teacher and the new, I call them Zoom jockey, running from here to here, while also demonstrating that they could be as present at work as possible. There's another layer, which is that this research found that there's a disproportionate impact on women of color as well, in terms of the risk, proximity to both being impacted by COVID, having family loss related to COVID. And then they took this next piece about the ways in which our particular moment is calling for folks to lean into a conversation around race. What they found was really impressive, which is that so many folks, 65% of folks are really indicating, these are white folks, that they're trying to step up their allyship. And that they're stepping up their allyship, half of them identify themselves as an ally. The next phase is that 52% of them indicated that they actually actively listen to women of color stories. And then 45% of them publicly acknowledge or give credit to women of color for their ideas. But then what we see is it starts dropping off, that 35%, if I see discrimination against women of color, I speak to it, I take a public stand, or this last part, which is I actually give of my time. The reason why I put this slide up here is that I really want us to kind of think about not only our mission statements, how it is that we're talking to our children, but how it is that we actually move into action. I think this actually gives us a sense about what action we could do. Are you giving of your time? Are you giving of your support? Are you listening? And I'm thinking about allyship broadly. Yes, this is a conversation about race, but in the places where I stand in privilege, how am I doing these things? How am I talking to and showing my kids these opportunities as well? So I'm going to pause here because I see there's a bunch of questions that have kind of come in that I want to be able to kind of engage in. So let's see. I'm going to just kind of take a quick moment to read these and see which one I can kind of get to. So I hear this question here is, how can we address children saying that they will use their privilege to do X, insert whatever, to children of color? It bothers me that the frame is one of a deficit for children of color. So I tell my daughter to let her classmates know that this is bothersome. I mean, I think I could hear this in many different ways. I'm going to lean into the portion and the idea that's around a framing of a deficit. So again, I'm not sure if I'm going to quite kind of get this question, but want to kind of speak about it in this way. I think it's really important that we don't have the automatic assumption that anyone is coming from a deficit or a deficient kind of space. I think the idea is, how do we step into allyship, or how do we step into living our values? So if your value or your family value is that we are upstanders, we're not bystanders. We when we see something wrong, we stand up for the person who's being impacted. We hope that people stand up for each other. There's a frame that you can have about what that would mean that doesn't come from a place of deficit. It's also not always only framing, I do this for other people. It's what you would like to do for yourself as well. Let's see. Okay, so see some of the kind of pieces here, which is, it seems like there's some questions around, can I suggest or make some references to places where people feel like they already have a foot in the door on these issues? So meaning that there's already an entree. So hopefully the kind of conversation regarding how to have a framework is helpful. But I do want to point you to a number of different resources, which we can have some time to kind of talk about. So those resources would include, and we'll put them in the chat or make them available, that there are a number of webinars, books, etc. But there's also, we're in a place right now where I don't think, we're not in the same place that we were 10 years ago, where it's not hard for us to find resources. If you're looking for an opportunity to talk, learn, or listen, there are multiple podcasts, there are multiple webinars, there's multiple articles. Many of those are referenced on my website, which you're happy to kind of take a look at. But I would also point you to an organization called Embrace Race as well. So I'm going to pause again. I know it's a little awkward where I take a moment, but I see that there's a bunch of questions. So I want to kind of take some time to kind of take a look at these and see how I can address these. So I have a question here that says, I have a hard time speaking to my teens from their point of view. How can I do better at that? So again, I want to think about this in terms of, and you're going to hear that this is my main kind of piece. What is a shared value that you have with your children? What's the articulated value that you have? We listen to each other. We pay attention to each other. It's really important that you feel heard. To start there. But another piece that I think this part really is raising is that much of my conversation so far has been really been focused on what we tell our children. But I want to pause a little bit and think about, it's not so much what we tell our children as how are we listening. So I'm going to give you a quick kind of example of a place where I don't think I did a great job of listening. So the other day, my daughter was really excited, my 10-year-old, because there's going to be an opportunity to do some Halloween-ish thing. And she's like, I know exactly the outfit, the dress that I want. And I said, well, what dress do you want? She's like, well, I want the dress that the white girl in Princess and the Frog wore. And I kind of paused because Princess and the Frog is the Disney movie that really features Tiana, which is a Black princess. And in that movie, she's got a friend who's very privileged, a little white girl, and it's pretty much one of the main white characters that's there. And my first reaction was, how are you going to watch a movie about Princess and the Frog and the only person that you want to look like is the white girl? And I was really just kind of taken aback. And I said it a little bit kinder than what I just said, but it was a surprise to me. Like, it's curious to me that of all the people on that show, what is that about? Which prompted down. So my daughter was like, no, that's okay. I actually want Tiana's dress. I want Tiana's dress. So she had learned really quickly that she wanted to value what I was demonstrating that I valued in that moment. So I tried to slow down and say, hey, I feel like I shut you down. I really want to hear this. I really want to talk a little bit more about this. And later on, she ended up kind of saying, I'm white too. She's a mixed girl. I'm like, yes, you are. And I want to talk more about it. She still wouldn't talk to me about it. And then finally, my mom came up, my mom who co-parents with us. And she said, the other day she was talking about wanting a dress that was like a quinceañera dress and a big poofy quinceañera dress, which actually looks just like the dress that the little white girl was wearing in the movie. And thankfully, there was someone in my household that had really been listening to what my daughter had been saying that she wanted this particular dress because of what it made her think like and feel like. And I give that example because I hadn't been listening. I was so eager to have my agenda. I was so worried that what she was telling me was that she didn't feel valued as a little Black girl, that I hadn't left the space to actually really listen. So to go back to this kind of question, how can I be listen to them from their point of view? You've got to spend a lot of time listening. And that listening also means watching, and it means what else can I be hearing? What else can I think about? How do we have this conversation with them? I'll turn to a couple of the different classrooms as well. So here's another one, which is TikTok has some very racist things on it. How do you address that without shaming or fostering? to see it themselves, not creating a parent-son conflict. So I think this raises a question again around something that we can start early on, but that can also happen. It has to be aligned with your values too, which is, I think it's the idea of co-watching. So are you able to kind of watch with your children as much as possible? Those of you that are earlier in terms of having your kids have these kinds of devices in their hands, it might be easier. But let's sit down. I know this is going to be really annoying, but we're going to watch the things that you watch for 5 minutes. And I want to talk with you about it. How do I understand it? And helping to support kids. And I think the idea is to pause and say, well, what do you see there? How do you understand that? How does that make you feel? It's the slowing down and asking about that. And there's also a way, well, it sounds like this is actually something that you really appreciate and like, and I want to understand that. But I also want to say that I don't like those images or I worry about those images. So I think it's okay for us to kind of separate. You can also explicitly narrate and say something like, I really don't want to make you feel bad, or I'm really not trying to shame you. But you've got to think about your tone as how you do that. And you also have to think about your invitation. And you also have to think about, is that really true? So I think many of us are intervening upon our children's media use by kind of jumping in and shutting it down, which sometimes needs to happen, or really commenting. That's different than co-watching. Co-watching is sitting and being together in a dialogue as well. Let's see, multiple kind of questions. So I just want to let the audience know that I have around 15 kind of questions. So I actually am going to pause here to do what I can to kind of go through the questions. I'm not going to be able to kind of get them all, but I'm going to try to get to them. And I see there's questions both coming in multiple different ways. So let's see if I can do this. So here's one. In what ways can we help BIPOC students? I'm assuming that these are school providers, through an anti-racist stand. Are there anti-racist curriculums I would recommend? So here's my analogous kind of work as I work within schools. The first thing I'm gonna do when I come to your school to give a conversation about anti-racism or anti-racist curriculum is I'm gonna ask you, what's the mission of your school? Does your mission of your school have a very clearly articulated space for addressing issues of diversity? Is that salient? Is that really important to you? So if it's not within the mission statement, then I'm going to work with the school to kind of figure out where does it fit. And many of the schools that I work with, I have to admit, across the Bay, across the nation, working in Atlanta and the East Coast, tend to have something around inclusion or diversity, but their operationalizing of that is where we kind of lose. So what does it mean to be a school that values diversity? How would we see that? Where would that show up in policy, procedure, school, education? So around this next part about, are there anti-racist curriculum? There's a lot of curriculum that's actually really helpful for thinking about and speaking about race. So I'm having an assumption about what I think anti-racist means, but that might be different for other folks. But there's two curriculati, sorry, my Latin's not great, that I would come to mind. One of which is teaching tolerance. So teaching tolerance is a pretty widely used, well-established multi-year kind of program. There's also facing history, facing ourselves. These are two pretty widely used. They're also, for example, in the Bay, there's a National Equity Project. There's a number of places that actually have these curriculum available and have these spaces to help folks. But more than anything, there is there's support for an engagement around these conversations. I would also point folks to Britt Hawthorne, who's another writer around these questions. And so that's there are, again, multiple spaces for us to be able to think about and get support. But also I'd be really interested in having folks talk about, what does anti-racism mean? What does that really feel like? How do we want to think about that? Okay, I've got a couple of different questions. Okay. Okay, so the two questions that I kind of see here that's going to give us a space to kind of talk about a number of different things is I'm going to come back to these. I'm trying to time it according to my slides. I'm going to come back to those and see a couple other ones that are here. Someone raises up this question, can I talk about how Asians tend not to be engaged in racial issues because we want to hold on to our status as the model minority? Thank you for raising up this question. I think it's really complicated. Within this question is someone saying we, so I'm going to assume that the person who's writing is also Asian. The first thing I would do is I would think about and try to understand whether or not, most Asians, some Asians, not all, there's a broad kind of panoply around Asian experiences and also Asian activism that I think due to racism often gets missed. But I also see this as an opportunity to talk about, and I've been in community with a lot of folks and a lot of Asian folks who are talking about this as an opportunity to think about anti-Blackness within the community. Here's the way that I kind of think about it, that I've been held in community to think about. We need to have a space for empathy and understanding as to why proximity to whiteness was sought out by many. I can think about that even within my own family, where skin color and colorism comes to play, and the ways in which two generations ago, the notion of passing was something that would allow more opportunity and safety, so that there was a compelling and big push for people to get closer and closer to whiteness as a means of survival. And then that is a history that many of our communities have laid down, that the idea that the fairer your skin, the closer to whiteness that you might be. And underneath that is both, yes, internalized oppression, internalized racism, internalized colonization, but also is a little bit of just trying to make sure that your kids are safe, that I just want to pause on a little bit, not a justification. But so the idea, again, that we can take back, which is that Irish folks weren't white when they got here. Italian folks weren't white when they got here. Persian folks weren't white. Iranian. So there has been a push to, and that push has been a outside external racist push for people to assume and to move towards proximity to whiteness as a means of safety. The question is that really working? The question is, can we unroot that? And can we think about how we could actually pay attention to all of our communities around where colorism still exists, colorism is present. I have a dissertation student who did a beautiful and comprehensive dissertation who found that within the UC system that Latinx students who had skin color had higher GPA. Now that is not due to some sort of inherent gift of skin color, but rather due to the prejudices that they experience, which he was also able to document. So colorism is shows up in that way. With this question around the model minority is the invisibilization of Asian folks due to oppression, and also the ways in which we have a history that really compelled and moved Asian folks to not want to be subject to racism in the way that it was showing up for Black folks. So it's complicated, it's hard, but can I talk about how Asians tend not to be? I would question the idea of tend and actually think about, do we have access to the ways in which Asian folks are really standing up and participating in racial justice work? I'll also pause to kind of mention on that. My notion around this is also really different as a Black woman who grew up in Hawaii. And so my sense of activism and my sense of racial justice really comes from leaders who are Asian. So complicated and generative question as well. Let's see, other questions. So many questions, let's see. Okay, here's a great question. They're all great, by the way. My teenage son says that he and his friends, who are a multiracial group, don't have any problems with race, and it's just the adults who are worried about it. He isn't interested in conversations about it because he feels like this generation will naturally change society, so they won't be an issue anymore. So I'm not sure how to engage him on this. So one is to kind of again, to really think in it, you've already done a beautiful job of listening. So listening to your son in this way, listening to what they're saying. And it also sounds like there's a space for questioning. I think one of the space for questioning is, I thought my generation had solved the issues of race as well. I grew up as a Gen Xer, and there's some research indication that shows that my generation of those born in the late 70s and 80s had more cross-race friendship, had lower experiences of prejudice, were less likely to be exposed to prejudice and bias in these particular ways. But we are also supported in colorblind thinking, which is that if we don't talk about it, or that don't speak about it, it won't be a problem. So I would love to engage with your son in a conversation with, we thought our generation had solved the problem too. How's that going? Are you calling me okay boomer? Are you understanding? So I think it's actually natural for each generation to think that they've solved this as a problem. And the research also indicates that this generation of kids, both these Gen Zoomers, Gen Z, and a little bit around millennials have different race-based ideas. And there's some great kind of research out that they have ideas that are different from previous generations. The salience of the conversation about it kind of tends to change. I would love to do that research now in this COVID kind of era. The other kind of piece is you mentioned multiracial groups. So I don't know if that means that your child or the group are mixed race, but I'd also pause and kind of think about um, listening to mixed race kids. How are mixed race kids feeling and doing? How are they um, responding to what's kind of going on? I've just been able to finish writing up a book on mixed race kids' experiences. And what we did is we listened to kids and mixed kids in particular talk about how they're faring and how they're doing. And what we heard is that they they're subject to and impacted by race as and it's not surprising, and that their identity changes and changes over time. I also think that there's a piece too, which is that our child's resistance to talk to us now doesn't mean that they're not going to talk to us later. We can continue to demonstrate that this is important. We can continue to demonstrate that this conversation has value for us. And this is also a place that we can challenge, argue, lovingly fight, be authoritative in our love and our boundaries around, and this is what we think, and let's talk about this. I know our families do this in different ways, but what our kids want, especially at the level of teens, is they want to be heard around this. And maybe they want to be heard with my experiences that this isn't a problem. Okay, I want to hear that. But it was a problem for me. What would you tell me now? How would I think about it? I think there's so many different questions and ways that we can kind of listen in. Here's another question, which is how would you guide our teen to deal with conversations with their peers that are of a racially different background that communicate self-deprecating jokes or stereotypes of themselves? Um, so here's another piece that I want to kind of say about this, which is that I'll give an example. I was working at a private school doing race based work, and they had decided to do a curriculum really focused on implicit bias with their eighth graders. And they did a beautiful, beautiful job. And the kids were really engaged. They're eighth graders and they're talking with each other. And they had written up this whole list of implicit biases that they had seen and they had noticed. And then the teacher came by to start handing out pieces of paper so they could write it. And the kids said, "What? You're handing out white paper? Oh, you're such a racist handing out that white piece of paper." And the poor teacher like froze in the moment. He froze, and you could tell that he was kind of like, oh, that's not what I really meant. But the idea is, those of you that have eighth graders know how provocative they are. Kids are supposed to play with it. But the way that kids learn about race is that they play with it. And that playing with race often makes us as adults really uncomfortable. That playing with race also means that it's our opportunity to put the guardrails in. So the idea is that the kids have to try it out, right? They have to have an opportunity to bowl that ball down the alley, but that we are the guardrails, which is I can see how you might think that's funny, but actually it's really not. Have you thought about the impact on other groups when you say this? I see that you're laughing at this, but I wonder what that means. So it's the idea that our kids are going to be in relationship with other kids having this kind of conversation, and one of which is that this is how they're learning and growing. So part of it is listening to, how does that make you feel? Are you feeling comfortable, not comfortable? What do you think the impact is on other kids when you do that? Not to move us to shame, but move us to listening. So that's the way that I would kind of think about that kind of piece, as well. Here's another kind of question. They keep on coming in. There's 22 still there, but we'll get to what we can kind of get to. My 12-year-old daughter, mixed Mexican and white, consistently has crushes on only white boys and men actors, influencers, artists. How do you explore and unpack this with her? Complicated kind of question. Again, part of this is thinking about, what are the values? What are the spaces? How do you understand this? One of which is also understand in the context of mixed kids and their development, that they are being impacted by what they see. It's not unusual for kids to move back and forth and move in multiple different places with how they identify. When I say back and forth, more aligned perhaps with their side of color, more aligned with their white side, more aligned with the side of mixed. That's not unusual. In fact, that's really typical, and that what kids are saying is they're feeling compelled to do so. I think much like the kind of conversation that I had with my daughter, is that I was really freaked out about my own kind of biases and perceptions. And what I really needed to have done in that moment was actually stop and slow down and think about, what is it that I'm worried about? And that maybe that's my worry and not hers. And to listen and perhaps build the conversation over time, which is, I notice that these are the kids that you seem to like or be attracted to. What do you think that's about? What do you think that means that you value? How do you feel about that? Where else? Right. So I think these are some of the pieces, which is to engage with her. And the idea is that this is a conversation that builds over time. I think it also makes sense in the context of, this is a child that's growing up in a mixed family. So how do you understand attraction? How do you understand why we are, liking each other? What does that mean? Does that mean that we are overcoming racial barriers? Does it mean that we are attracted to white standards? What does it really mean? But you got to think about that for yourself as well. So another kind of question that I got, which is, to other parents who are resistant to talk about diversity or wish to decide the form in which this education takes shapes. Many schools are getting a lot of backlash. So that's a fantastic kind of question. You have to be affirmed in what this means for you before you start talking to other parents about it. Then we get the opportunity to think about what this means for our community. I saw a kind of conversation about this elsewhere as well, which is, unfortunately, or rather fortunately, I feel like I'm often in the position of having to kind of sell diversity. So, meaning, why is diversity important? So, and as a nerd psychologist, I can say that research is pretty consistent and pretty robust that kids that grow up in environments that are ethnically and otherwise diverse tend to have higher sense of themselves, better sense of themselves, higher cognitive functioning, better academic outcome. Like, I can speak that kind of language about what is compelling. And why is that true? Because diversity of thought is really valued. Diversity of experiences are really valued. And they are translating to a world where diversity is really present. So on one hand is the space around diversity has to be a value. In terms of schools that are getting backlash, when people go to schools, they sign implicit or sometimes an explicit contract. And that contract is who the school is. So in the case of private schools, you've got a dedicated mission. So when I talk to teachers about this, and teachers often will say, well, I've got my value statement, and I've got my teaching mission statement, but it's a real struggle when I have to argue with a parent who's resistant to this conversation. And part of the thing that we do with teachers is we say, well, it's one thing, when you have to rest on it, but it's much easier when you say, we here at the school value diversity. And it's way easier to do when you've got administration, when you've got a website, when you've got a DEI space, when you've got teachers and other parents that are with you to invoke a community standard, which is, we value a conversation around diversity. We value racial justice and how it shows up. Schools are going to have to take a stand. And this is not unlike, I know the parallel is, this is not to equate them, but schools have to take a stand with how they're understanding whether or not they're going to be in person or not, whether or not their teachers are going to be there or not. Schools have to take stands all the time. So, and backlash is part of it. You know, backlash is this kind of piece, which is um, got to stand with strong with that. I just was talking to a school that was getting approached by many of the parents saying, "Can we have a tuition reduction because this is looking really different in terms of distance learning?" Many schools are making that decision, but this was a school that said, "No, we're not going to be doing that. And here's why. Here's the additional time. Here's the additional services. We know that this is really hard. We try to make things available in terms of financial aid." But it was a stand. Was there backlash? Yes. But was it a value for them that they needed to value their staff and be able to prepare themselves in a particular way? Yes. So I don't want to make this a false equivalency, but I think people have to make a stand that if a school is really making a decision to do this, then it's easier when you're in community to do that. So school administrator, teachers, and then the community within. So, you know, when you're talking with others who are resistant, part of the kind of mechanism that I also would invoke is how do you find shared values? So this may be a place that we don't have a shared value, the diversity or being able to talk about race or being able to think about race is actually something that's really important to me. I wonder if we have a different opinion around that. How do we think about um, where our shared values are and where we might have a place to kind of coordinate? So again, I think that's a really challenging question, and also another question that's related to a lot of schools are doing a reckoning right now. I know many schools here, many schools that I've been working with are having their students and their alumni speak about what their experiences are like and have been like. And so you all might be subject to it, but it's definitely part of the schools that I work with on the East Coast, the kind of hashtag Black at name the private school, or brown at name the private school. So there's a reckoning, an opportunity to re-know, to reconnect up with people's experiences that I think are deeply impactful in and are showing up in private school spaces. I think more and more often, and I think and I hope that this is a space that we can listen in and figure out how we'd like to have our movement of supporting and thinking kids aligned with our values as people, communities, and schools as well. A question that's along the lines of this, which is how can we have real productive conversations with those who have differing opinions on the subject of race and bias, especially when it feels like such difference reflects differing ethics and morals? Um, a beautiful and complex question that I think strikes at the heart of this. And with the 12 minutes that I have left, I want to invite us to think about hopefully there's a structure that's embedded here, which is the structure is the first thing is we have to think very deeply about how do we understand these ideas ourselves and where are our values. I'm going to borrow from another two great theorists that I think have been really helpful in this conversation, which are Doctors Del Prado and Kim. I'm going to ask James to actually provide a link within, I don't know if we can do it within the chat. I don't think we can, but we'll provide it for you, which is they have a book called How to Talk Listen. And it's an opportunity, it's a structure for thinking about how do we engage in these conversations. One of the main pieces of this, or the piece I connect up with, is values. So you've got to think about what do I appreciate, what do I privilege in terms of my time, where do I think about it this way: if you had a choice between two complicated things, what would you choose? That's actually demonstrating where you're valuing it and what the value is in that moment. So how do you have these difficult connections? You've got to listen for a possible space of shared values. You've got to listen for a place of some moment of kind of connection and to have that be the opening kind of window. This is really, really challenging to do. There are a number of resources I want to point you to. Greater Good in Action has an organization around bridging, which thinks about the multiple different things that it takes and concepts that it takes to actually be able to bridge differences and bridge these hard kind of conversations. So there are spaces and there are tools that we can use to rely upon, but I would encourage us to kind of think about what are the places that I have difficult conversations, what works out really well, when I ask people to think about the places that they have challenging conversations, people say that these conversations typically go well when they rest upon their experience, their listening, their ability to know that they're going to make mistakes, their ability to listen and to wonder, curiosity, that those are kind of components or traits that can be invoked in these difficult conversations. The other thing that I think it really takes is time. If we have the expectation that I'm going to be able to engage in this conversation with a beautiful clap back, that means moving quickly. That's not about having the time to do this, having the time to slow things down, to really listen. Just talking to a client of mine who said they were in this moment of having difficult conversations, and the invitation was to listen to the other person and to listen and to say thank you, and no other response back. Thank you, I want to listen to that. Like, the practice of radical listening is something that we've gotten out of the habit of doing. I think it's aligned actually with this conversation too, which is how do we talk to our teens about cancel culture? With this generation, there seems to be no room for mistakes, growth, and a healthy, respectful dialogue. This is a pace that I've been really interested, because I tend to align with the sense about kind of and being surprised by cancel culture. But it's also a place where actually, when you listen to younger folks, what does it really mean to be canceled? What does that really mean to show up? It's a place that I'd like to listen a little bit more about who's being canceled and why. And when I've leaned in to listen to, I'll tell you, like my 14-year-old goddaughter, she's actually had told me that the places that some of the people that she's canceled actually have long-standing evidence of being harmful and of not listening and of not growing. So I think we can invite the dialogue around, can you make mistakes? What do those mistakes look like? How could you be accountable? What would it take? And it's also what we want to offer ourselves, right? Because I think the challenge of cancel culture, and the challenge that I hear so many teens talking about, I had a teen say, I'm getting all this stuff on my phone about what's going on in terms of racialized violence, and I don't know what to say, because if I say the wrong thing, right? If I say the wrong thing, I'll be canceled. And that is something that I feel like we struggle with conversations often. But what if we could actually support them in saying, can you narrate that? I want to be able to participate in this dialogue, but I'm worried about what I'm going to say. I'm going to try this out. Let's be in dialogue together. There's ways that we can invite these kind of conversations, but we have to be able to practice that ourselves. So I think, how do we address kind of cancel culture is one of which is we have to think about, what are we modeling and invoking with our kids as well? How are we actually demonstrating, hey, this person really made a big mistake, but here's how they were accountable. Here's how I made a mistake, and here's how I'm trying to be accountable as well. Let's see. Here's a question that comes up a lot, is related to another one as well. How do parents help to make their schools better for BIPOC without asking BIPOC to do the work to solve it? This is a great and frequent kind of question. It's one of the reasons why I put up that slide around from McKinsey, which is that I think it takes more than identifying oneself as I think it takes more than listening to people's stories about their pain. But I think it takes the practice of standing up to interrupt bias when somebody sees it, to take a risk in making a mistake and offending someone. And it takes time and sharing time. It also takes an investment in reckoning with oneself. Beautiful thing is that there are tons of opportunities to do so. There's a number of programs, there are a number of books, there are a number of guides, there's a number of 28-day challenges for people to kind of reckon. I would point to Rachel Cargill, who has a 28-day anti-racist challenge. I would point to the anti-racist table, a space that encourages people to kind of come and be part of dialogue and hold themselves accountable. I would point to Surge, Standing Up for Racial Justice, which is an organization that actually encourages white folks to come together and think about it. The benefit is that there are lots of different options. They require time. They require sacrifice. I see another link, Layla Saad and her Good Ancestors podcast. It's a beautiful one. There's lots and lots of different opportunities and options. So I appreciate the ask. And it's a Google way to find some of these spaces. But more important than the Googling is be in community with each other. Where are the spaces within your schools to have a white accountability group, to have a DEI group? Where are the opportunities for us to really, do some of these things? I'm going to ask, because I know I've been listing a whole bunch of resources. My angel, who I call him, James, is actually helping put some of these resources in there. So Embrace Race is one that I would have and really point to. Surge, Standing Up for Racial Justice, is another one that I would point to as places that people can kind of go. And, there are other folks that have been putting in some things here that we can make sure that get kind of shared, but I can share some of those as well. Let me, in the kind of 4-5 minutes, I see James is putting them in as well. And also seeing, modeling is actually really important. I see there's so many. Let's see. I see there's a question that's up front, which is, I'm comfortable talking about race, but I'm not an expert. So my biggest barrier is that I want to make sure that I'm saying the right things and addressing race and injustice and discrimination properly, so my kids can be allies. I so appreciate that question. I think it's very much related to the other pieces that we've been talking about, which is the worry around cancel culture. So I think the invitation is, let's make the mistake. Let me talk to my kids in a way and make the mistake, and then actually be accountable. I'm sorry, I talked to you and it actually didn't work out so well. Like, I'm still apologizing to my daughter about my comment around the dress. But not only apologizing, I'm also trying to be accountable. I want to think more about this. Was a moment that I wasn't listening to you. How can we talk about this some more? And of course, she just wants to buy the dress at this moment, but I'm going to come back to it. It's going to be, remember that time. I think if we go into this assuming that we have to have the right things, expertise is required, we get stuck. You don't have to have expertise. You have your lived experience. You have what you think about it. You have the invitation to be with your children and to talk about it, because no one is doing race perfectly. I'm sure I've offended, with how many of you here, with 300-400 people here, I'm sure I've stepped on some toes. And my hope is that I could be in community with you and apologize and be accountable. But again, the opportunities that we really have are to make those mistakes and to narrate them for our children. I didn't like the way that I did that. I felt poorly about the way that I did it. I'm going to do this differently. Okay. So these are some of the ways, right? And I also hear this up front, like, what are the right ways to talk about race? I want to invite, there are no right ways. I think the wrong, or the most wrong way, is to be silent. I think to not talk about these issues leaves our children bereft of the opportunity to learn from us and to learn with us. So that's how I would like to kind of actually pause as we get close to the very end. There's so many questions that are here and really present. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be with you and for your questions. And I hope that it spurs some conversation, and I really appreciate your time. So I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Briscoe-Smith. This was amazing, and I think we all learned so much. And I think if we can all wake up tomorrow taking that idea of being gentle with ourselves and others, and almost kind of really expansive empathy that you've referred to so many times this evening into our lives and into our relationships with our children, that will be definitely making a step forward in being able to deal with this really complex issue that you've been discussing this evening. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to everyone who attended. Please send us your feedback in the survey that you're going to receive after this event. Please do take advantage of all the resources that Dr. Briscoe-Smith mentioned, and go to her website, drbriscoesmith.com, where she has all of those available for you. And we will see you at the next SSALA event. Thank you all and have a great evening.